Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a sweeping feature-length adaptation of the Gospel of John to really understand its core structure and, ultimately, its message. We're going to look closely at how this source material uses historical narrative, progressive tension, and massive theological claims to craft a very specific, highly targeted viewing experience.
So, let's dive right into this epic narrative. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Word becomes flesh, move into miracles and divine claims, look at the rising tensions and conflict, walk through the crucifixion and resurrection, and finally, break down the film's ultimate message.
All right, Section 1. The Word becomes flesh, establishing the premise. Now, the source material doesn't begin with your traditional birth story or a childhood origin arc. Instead, it starts by framing its protagonist in a massive, cosmic, pre-existent context.
What's really fascinating here is how the narrative establishes its foundational theology right out of the gate. By opening with this specific text, the film portrays Jesus not just as a prophet or some historical figure who just showed up on the timeline, but literally as the eternal creator who existed before the world itself.
And that right there defines the central premise of the entire narrative, the claim that the very architect of the universe stepped directly into human history. As the text puts it, this Word became a human being and lived among us. Everything that follows in the story is built squarely on the audience grasping this specific, monumental claim.
Which brings us to Section 2, Miracles and Divine Claims, proving the premise. Let's see how this builds into the second act, where the film actually shows Jesus backing up these massive claims through some very public acts.
The film presents these events not as random magic tricks, but as a carefully structured progressive timeline of signs. And these signs are specifically designed to validate his divine authority. It all starts relatively privately, at a wedding in Cana, but then it rapidly escalates to highly public, seemingly impossible feats, like feeding 5,000 people, and ultimately calling a man named Lazarus out of a grave after 4 days.
And this brilliantly illustrates the film's absolute favorite recurring narrative device. Characters constantly take Jesus literally when he's speaking spiritually. When he tells Nicodemus he must be born again, Nicodemus asks how a grown man can re-enter his mother's womb. When he offers the Samaritan woman living water, she points out he doesn't even have a bucket. The source material is continually contrasting human physical limitations with Jesus' spiritual propositions.
Moving on to Section 3, Rising Tensions and Conflict. The cost of the claims. As you can probably imagine, walking around claiming to be the sole source of eternal life creates some severe friction with the religious establishment.
The tension ramps up step by step as Jesus publicly shatters social norms. He heals a paralyzed man on the sacred Sabbath day, which directly defies religious law. He stops the stoning of an adulterous woman. But most dangerously of all, he continuously calls God his own Father, placing himself on an absolutely equal plane with the divine.
The absolute tipping point is when Jesus uses the sacred, ancient divine name, I am, for himself. In the context of the story, the authorities immediately view this as pure blasphemy, punishable by stoning. It's the definitive line in the sand, and it's what pushes the narrative toward its inevitable, violent conclusion.
The entire narrative hinges on this exact political calculation by the high priest Caiaphas. By framing Jesus as a threat who's going to bring the wrath of the Roman Empire down on their entire nation, Caiaphas sets the irresistible momentum for the story's climax. So it's no longer just a theological dispute, right? It is now presented as a matter of urgent national security.
And that leads us to Section 4, Crucifixion and Resurrection, the climax. This is the dark, incredibly rapid culmination of the film's plot, often referred to as the Passion Sequence.
The sequence of events moves at just breakneck speed here. We see the betrayal by Judas in the garden, the tragic denial by Peter by the charcoal fire, the political trial under Roman authority, the brutal execution at Golgotha, and finally, the discovery of the empty tomb.
During that trial sequence, the Roman governor Pilate asked this profound philosophical question: what is truth? The film uses this moment to heavily contrast Pilate's cynical political pragmatism with Jesus' earlier claim that he physically embodies the ultimate truth of the universe.
When we reach the crucifixion, Jesus' final words on the cross are simply, "It is finished." Now, it's absolutely vital to notice that these words are portrayed in the source not as a gasp of tragic defeat, but rather as the triumphant completion of a predetermined divine mission. The narrative insists that this was the plan all along.
The film then resolves its deep narrative tension perfectly through the disciple Thomas. Thomas represents the ultimate skeptic, right? He's demanding physical proof, demanding to actually touch the scars. But upon seeing the resurrected Jesus, he immediately shifts to absolute devotion, declaring, "My Lord and my God." This powerful character arc serves directly as a proxy for the skeptical viewer.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the film's ultimate message, the call to action. Let's explore how the source material shifts gears entirely in its final moments, breaking completely away from the ancient historical narrative.
We really have to ask this foundational question: why did the creators condense this ancient biography into this specific presentation? What's the actual goal behind this entire recounting of the Gospel of John?
Well, the narrator answers this directly using the text itself. The explicit, impartial purpose of the media is to persuade the viewer to convert. The film is not shy about this at all. It openly states that the recounting of these miracles and events is a deliberate mechanism to generate personal faith in the audience.
The film's epilogue then steps completely out of the first century and lays out specific, modern-day theological steps. It proposes a three-step method: agreeing with God about sin, relying on the cross for payment, and receiving grace. It presents this as the direct, actionable way for the viewer to achieve the eternal life that Jesus talked about throughout the entire story.
It concludes by breaking the fourth wall completely. A narrator guides the viewer through a proposed prayer, literally inviting them to make a personal affirmation of faith right then and there. The film transforms from a movie you're just passively watching into an active choice you are being asked to make.
And this leaves us with a fascinating final thought to ponder. Does the story change when its ultimate goal is not just to entertain or to inform, but to actually convert the viewer? It's a really compelling lens through which to view narrative adaptations that carry explicit evangelistic agendas. Think about how the structure of the media we consume directly influences the message we ultimately walk away with.